After lasting for thousands of years, slavery was destroyed over most of the world in a period of about 1 century, and over virtually all of the world within 2 centuries. The destruction of this ancient and worldwide institution was all the more remarkable because it was accomplished in the face of determined opposition and cunning evasion at every level, from the individual slaveholders to the heads of nations and empires. Moreover, the drive for the destruction of slavery came not from any of the objective, material, or economic factors so often assumed to be dominant in history, but from a moral revulsion against slavery, which began in the late 18th century in Great Britain, the country which was the largest slave-trading nation of its day, with highly profitable slave plantation colonies. When the anti-slavery political crusade began among evangelical Christians in 18th century Britain, no one thought it would be possible to end slavery. The most fervent crusaders among them hoped only to be able to stop the continued enslavement and international trading of human beings. Any thought that the very institution of slavery itself could be abolished was considered utopian. Yet the mobilization of public opinion in Britain against the slave trade produced such powerful and enduring political pressures that successive generations of British governments found themselves forced to push the anti-slavery effort further and further toward its logical conclusion, first to abolish the international slave trade, then to abolish slavery throughout the British Empire, and finally to pressure, bribe, and coerce other nations into abolishing slavery as well. The Quakers were the first organized religious group in Britain to reject the institution of slavery and to impose on their members a requirement that they not hold any slaves. But the larger political effort to get the slave trade banned by government was led by others inspired by the Quakers. This worldwide political revolution against slavery began with a small and rather conservative group of evangelicals within the Church of England, conservative people who distanced themselves from the emotionalism of the Methodists and whose principal leader, William Wilberforce, was such a relentless opponent of the radical ideas arising from the French Revolution that he wanted to have those ideas stamped out in England by government censorship. Among the other members of the inner Clapham Sect that began the crusade against the slave trade was the very reserved and dignified Henry Thornton, wealthy banker and a landmark figure in the development of monetary economics. Yet these were the leaders of a movement whose achievement was one of the most revolutionary in the history of the human race. Seldom was there a group of revolutionaries that so defied stereotypes in a crusade that defied the odds. Repeatedly and resoundingly defeated in Parliament on bills to abolish the slave trade, Wilberforce, Thornton, and their supporters persisted for 20 years until finally, on February 27, 1807, the House of Commons passed such a bill, 283-16. It was a remarkable victory from a mass mobilization of public opinion. And once mobilized, this public opinion proved to be so strong, so tenacious, so enduring, and ultimately so irresistible that the anti-slavery crusade was swept along beyond its original goals of stopping the international trade in human beings to abolishing slavery itself throughout the British Empire and eventually throughout the world. Once the moral problems of slavery had been understood and accepted by the British public, the support to end slavery spread far beyond the particular religious group that initiated it. Socially, it extended across class lines, from the rich to the poor, from the working class to the titled nobility. In an age before mass communication, mass transit, or mass movements, people were astonished to see petitions arrive in Parliament with tens of thousands of signatures demanding an end to the slave trade. At one point, Parliament received more than 800 petitions within a month, containing a total of 700,000 signatures. The anti-slavery movement proved to be as unrelenting as it was widespread. British missionaries fueled the public's outrage with their reports from Africa itself, reports widely disseminated by a powerful missionary lobby in London. Not all government officials favored the anti-slavery cause by any means, and some in both the civil and military establishments resented the extra burdens put upon them by this cause, as well as the complications that the anti-slavery crusade made in British foreign relations. But the political pressures forced successive British governments to continue their worldwide opposition to slavery. Though slavery did not exist in Britain itself, it became such a factor in British domestic politics that candidates for political office felt a need to declare where they stood on the issue. By the mid-1820s, being pro-slavery was considered a political liability. British warships were sent on patrol off West Africa, boarding not only British ships to inspect them for slaves, but also boarding the ships of some other nations who had voluntarily granted them this right. By the early 1840s, Britain began to urge the Ottoman Empire to abolish the slave trade within its dominions. The initial response of the Ottoman Sultan was described by the British ambassador. "I have been heard with extreme astonishment, accompanied with a smile, at a proposition for destroying an institution closely interwoven with the frame of society in this country, and intimately connected with the law and with the habits and even the religion of all classes, from the Sultan himself on down to the lowest peasant." Britain was far in advance of most of the rest of the world in its opposition to slavery. However, its example inspired abolitionists in the United States, and the French government later abolished slavery in its own empire and then sent its navy on patrol in the Atlantic to help intercept slave-trading ships. Eventually, opposition to slavery would spread throughout Western civilization, even to despotic governments like that of Tsarist Russia, which stamped out slavery among its Central Asian subjects. The European offshoot societies of the Western Hemisphere all abolished slavery before the end of the 19th century, and the spread of Western imperialism to Asia and Africa brought slavery under pressure around the world. Outside of Western civilization, the anti-slavery effort was opposed and evaded, especially in the Islamic world. Repeated pressure on the Ottoman Empire led its government to decree a ban on the slave trade within its domains in 1847, even though this ban led, as expected, to discontent and revolt among Ottoman subjects. However, mindful of the opposition within, Ottoman authorities were not very active at trying to stamp out the slave trade. Eventually, the British government threatened to begin boarding Ottoman ships in the Mediterranean to search for slaves, unless the Ottomans themselves began enforcing the ban on the forbidden slave trade. Nor was the Ottoman Empire the only foreign government to feel the pressure of British anti-slavery policy. In 1873, British warships anchored off Zanzibar and threatened to blockade the island unless the slave market there closed down. It closed. A sharp distinction is apparent between the ending of slavery in Western civilization and in non-Western regions. By 1888, slavery had been abolished throughout the Western Hemisphere, yet the struggle to end slavery, or even the slave trade, continued on into the 20th century in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The British added naval patrols in the Indian Ocean and the Persian Gulf after the Ottoman Empire's formal ban on slave trading provided the legal cover for such intervention. Yet slave trading continued on land until after European imperialism took control of most of the African continent. Only then could the attempt be made to stamp out slavery itself. The difference between the Western and the non-Western worlds as regards the ending of slavery is perhaps epitomized in the words used to describe the process. Emancipation, a once-and-for-all process in the Western Hemisphere, and the decline of slavery in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, where it was a more protracted process that lasted well into the 20th century. Even after Western hegemony extended into many nations of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, slavery continued in remote regions of Borneo, Burma, Cambodia, and other parts of Southeast Asia. Among the Islamic nations of North Africa and the Middle East, the abolition of slavery came especially late, with Saudi Arabia, Mauritania, and the Sudan continuing to hold slaves on past the middle of the 20th century. Mauritania officially abolished slavery on July 5, 1980, though its own officials admitted that the practice continued after the ban. Non-Western societies never developed the crusading zeal which led to the destruction of slavery wherever European power extended. Nevertheless, the national stigma of slavery eventually became a factor in the restriction or abolition of slavery in non-Western countries which did not wish to appear before the world, meaning largely the European world, as backward or uncivilized. Thus, the King of Burma took the lead in officially outlawing slavery in that country in the 19th century, though it continued to exist on into the 20th century. Siam began to crack down on slavery in the late 19th century, under the influence of foreign opinion. The rise of nationalism among Southeast Asian countries in general gave an impetus to the effort to stamp out slavery in the 20th century, in order to gain respect from the world's leading nations, which meant Western nations. In the Philippines at the beginning of the 20th century, an American report on the continuation of slavery there was seen by Filipino leaders as a blow against their efforts to gain independence. Even within the Islamic world, which retained the institution of slavery longest, Westernized elites began to oppose slavery, whether out of conviction or out of embarrassment. In short, slavery was ultimately destroyed morally. Though the chief instrument of this destruction was the overwhelming military power of the West, combined with the prestige of Western civilization, based at this juncture in history on its economic, scientific, and technological achievements. Ironically, after anti-Western views became fashionable among Western intellectuals in the late 20th century, desperate expedients of rhetoric were resorted to in order to depict the destruction of slavery by European civilization as somehow serving the economic interests of European powers. Help us grow by liking this video, subscribing for future updates, and clicking the bell icon to never miss a video.